Today we're going to be talking about issues related to property rights in the economic development of America, and we've already touched on this in a few of the previous lectures. If you remember from state capacity, we talked about how it was important for a country to establish property rights, and it's important for the government to protect those property rights. We also talked about this in slavery when we talked about one of the things that made slaves valuable was that they were considered property, and that those property rights gave slave owners the ability to go do things that you wouldn't have been able to do with free labor. Well, we want to talk about property rights generally. We're going to start off by talking about what does property right even mean? Where do property rights come from? Then we're going to talk about a few things that were unique about property rights in the United States, and then we'll conclude by talking about how property rights helped establish the Western frontier. From the very beginning of the United States, property rights has been an important issue in establishing the economic development. James Madison said, "If the United States mean to obtain or deserve the full praise due to wise and just governments, they will equally respect the rights of property." So from right there at the very beginning, we're thinking about how we respect property and how we make sure that people get to have what they create. But what is property? In that same talk, James Madison said, "That dominion which one man claims and exercises over the external things of the world, in exclusion of every other individual." So to have something as property means that I have exclusive rights to determine how this thing is used. So you can see all these things back here are my property. And so this little Miles Morales doll, I get to decide how this is used. I get to put it where I want on my bookshelf. I get to decide if my kids want to play with it. Well, not if they want to play with it. Obviously, my kids want to play with it. But I get to decide whether they play with it or not because this is mine. I have property over this thing. I have the claim to use this at the exclusion of others. That's what James Madison said at the very end, was we could exclude other people from using these things. But where does property come from? What gives me the right to exclude people from using that toy? What gives me the right to exclude people from coming in my house? Where does property come from? A common answer I get when I ask students this is they say, well, you bought it and that means you get to have it. But why? Why does that mean that I get to have it if I bought it? That means that somebody else had it. But why were they allowed to sell it to me? Like, I could go and take this computer or phone that you are watching this video on, and I could give you $5 and take it, and I could claim that I bought it, right? I gave you money for it, and now this thing is mine. But that doesn't make sense, right? Like, so there's something about you being willing to give it up that needs to be in there, but also just what gives you the initial right? What gives the person you bought it from the initial right to hold that thing as property? So it's not just a question of, oh, I bought it. It goes deeper than that. Another common answer is that it comes from the consent of society, that we all together say, oh, this thing is yours, and therefore we respect that. Like, we will all agree that that's yours. But this is a really finicky answer. What if society starts changing its mind and saying, no, that thing is not yours, or maybe everything should be everyone's? So, like, socialists generally believe that people should not have private property, that these things should be available to the world. On the other end of the spectrum, the hardcore libertarians are saying everything should be personal property and we should have to pay somebody to use anything. So this question has been addressed many times, but I want to go over a theory proposed by John Locke. John Locke was an English philosopher, and his theory actually forms the basis for a lot of American property law. So I want to make sure that we understand where that's coming from. John Locke proposed this interesting puzzle on where property comes from. He said, Revelation gives us an account of those grants God made of the world to Adam and to Noah and his sons. It is very clear that God, as King David says, has given the earth to the children of men, given it to mankind in common. Basically, John Locke is saying, well, how can we have property if it's very clear from the foundational text of society at that time that God himself gave that property to everyone, that everyone was supposed to be able to have it, like that private property was not created at the beginning. Now, whether you believe in the account of the Bible or not, that's not the important part of this. It could be just as well, hey, we are all growing and evolving, and like, why do all of a sudden we get property? So John Locke's question is, if from the beginning of man, everything was common, what led us to have property? Why can we have property? Is there any justification that we can have property? His argument is really interesting because what he says is everything on earth at the very beginning was common to man except for your labor, your body, the thing that you own. Like no one else has property over your individual person. And so the things that you do with your labor are actually your property, okay? So let's start from there. You have property over your body. Well, let's say I walk up to an apple tree and I pick this apple and I happen to take the seeds out and I go plant those seeds in another place. I till the ground, I plant those seeds, and a new apple tree comes up. That tree exists in that place only because I added my labor to it. So I took something that was common to all, that apple that was common property to everybody, and then I bring it over to some place with my labor. I'm bringing it over. With my labor, I'm tilling the ground. I'm cultivating this tree. And now suddenly this thing only exists because of my labor. It embodies my labor. And now, because your labor, your property created this thing, it is also your property. So John Locke's theory is that you can take things from common ownership to private ownership by putting in your own personal property and creating something new. And then once that thing's yours, now you can sell it, you can pass it on to your descendants, you can do what you want with that. That becomes private property that you can exchange. But the genesis of property came from the fact that we own our bodies and we can choose what we do with that labor. Not only is this just interesting as we think about the philosophy of what property is, this is actually really important because it forms the foundation of homesteading laws that we're going to talk about later in this lecture. So why do we think property rights are important? Why was James Madison at the very beginning worried about whether we were establishing property rights in the United States? I want to bring this up in the context of Up. I want to talk about Carl and Ellie. I want to talk about it in the context of them going to South America.
It's like America, but south.
To get to South America, they needed to be able to save. So what they were doing was foregoing current consumption, right? They had income and they could have been spending that on things today, but then they were putting it away and saving for something in the future. Now they could only do that because they knew that in the future they would have that money. Now, of course, they kept breaking the jar and going and using that to cover other really important expenses, but the idea is they could only even do that because they had property over it. They knew that this thing wasn't going to be stolen. So let's think of a simple model of property rights and investment. And this model is just gonna have a few assumptions. The first assumption, individuals can do two things with their income. They can consume it today, or they can save for tomorrow and consume it in the future. The second assumption, individuals want to balance their consumption today and tomorrow. I don't wanna consume all of my income today because then I won't have something tomorrow. But here's the third assumption. If I consume today, I can consume all of it today. 100% guaranteed I can have the full, if I have $100, I can spend all $100 today. But the future is uncertain because of insecure property. If I hold on to that $100, I might lose some of it, maybe $10, maybe I lose the whole thing. There's some sort of probability associated with whether I'm going to lose that money in the future if I decide to hold on to it rather than consume it. So that creates some sort of risk for the future where I might not get that thing if I hold on to it. And risk affects our investments. Now, the investment here is saving this for the future. And if there's a risk that I won't be able to have it in the future, then in some ways, and for some people, I'm going to reduce how much I spend. And so the conclusion here is that property rights, the strength of your property rights, determine how much you invest in the future. If you have strong property rights, you're confident that you're going to have your money in the future. And if you have weak property rights, you just aren't that sure what's going to come down the line. And so you decide to have more of it today. You consume it today rather than waiting for the future and getting a return on that investment. Property rights are important because they guide how much we invest. And investment is important for building our economy. So we want strong property rights where we can protect people's property and make sure that they get the things that they save for, that they get to keep the things that they built. But there's also a really interesting paradox with property rights, and Carl and Ellie can show this as well. Property rights in some cases can be too strong. Just look at what happened with Carl and Ellie. Well, I guess it's just Carl at this point. F in the chat for Ellie. But poor Carl, he's holding on to this house, and it is just surrounded by nothing else, because they're trying to build up this development. Now, this indicates that his property rights are really strong, that these developers cannot push him out of this house. And this is not an unrealistic thing. This is actually inspired by another house, and now people hang balloons on this house because it's this monument to, maintaining your property rights, even though like there's a lot of value being created around you. Honestly, the value of this house is minuscule compared to the value created by creating more apartments around this area to make sure there are more housing for people. But that's neither here nor there. The point is, sometimes property rights are really strong, and even when people want to develop in those areas, even when it could create a lot of value if we let them develop in those areas, those people hold on to those property rights. And this sometimes gets taken to the extreme. There's a phenomenon in China called nail houses, where just houses stick out like nails sticking out of a board. One of my favorites is this picture here of this house in the middle of the road. They could not get these people out of the house, and so they just decided to build the road around the house. And so as you're driving down this, think about the effect this has on people. As you're driving down this road, you have to slow down as you approach this house, get around it, and then you can get back up to speed. This affects people. I wonder what accidents are like around here. I can't imagine that this house is of any value to the people living in it, but apparently it is, because they just stick around. So there's this fundamental tension right here, that we want strong property rights to encourage investment, but if property rights are too strong, then they actually can decrease value, right? Like, we want to be able to get rid of some of these properties to make sure that we can replace them with things that are of even higher value. This is actually enshrined in the Constitution. The Fifth Amendment says, "No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation." Look at the tension in both parts of this statement. No person shall be deprived of property without due process. So it's saying, yeah, we're protecting property. You can't be deprived of it. But maybe if we have due process, if there's a due process involved, if we go through the things we're supposed to go to, then yes, okay, we can deprive you of property. And then in the second half, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. We're not going to take the property for it from you unless we compensate you, right? There's this tension. There's an understanding that you need to protect these property rights, but there are times when we'll need to violate them. This is called the takings clause, and it is this property rights paradox. It's really interesting. Now, I really enjoy this paper by Naomi Lamoureux, who wrote about this paradox and the mystery of property rights. It's fantastic. If you're interested in this issue, I encourage you to go ahead and look up that paper. Naomi is a fantastic scholar who has taught me so much about property rights. Another fantastic scholar that has taught me about American property rights is Claire Priest. She is a law professor at the Yale Law School, and she wrote about how we created an American property law. And she's arguing that there were some American innovations in property rights laws that led to long-run economic development in America that allowed it to, run past a lot of competing countries. To help me understand this, let me clarify that there are two types of property. There's real property, which is like, think about real estate, so land, things that are, the way that I remember was real estate, right? Land, things that are just fixed right there. And then there's chattel property, and those are things that can be moved. That's, you tip a house upside down, anything that falls, that's chattel property. That things that can be moved and taken from one place to another. Real property, chattel property, two things that are going on here. Well, English law, before America declares independence and becomes a country, they were under English law, and English law had a special protection in place for real property. So let me clarify again, there's secured credit and unsecured credit. Secured credit is when you put something up as collateral for a loan. So when you go get a mortgage, you put your house up as collateral for that loan. If you don't pay that loan, the bank can take the house and use it to cover the loan. Same thing with a car loan. When you get a car loan, you put your car up for collateral, and if you fail to pay, they can take the car. Unsecured credit means that you haven't put any property up as collateral. Think of this like a credit card loan. When you use your credit card, you're getting an unsecured loan and they're just lending you funds, and if you fail to pay them, they're not going to come and seize your house, at least not automatically. You haven't made that arrangement with your credit card company. So if you get unsecured loans, like a credit card loan, they're going to try to get their money back when you fail to pay the loan by taking you to court and trying to take the property that you do have, right? If you have a house and you didn't pay your credit card loan, they might try to take your house or your car or something like that, but they have to go through a procedure. It's not automatic like a secured loan. Well, in this English law, they actually stopped creditors from going after land. They made it incredibly difficult for you to try and get land to cover that unsecured credit. And even in the few cases where they did allow you to get that land, they made it incredibly difficult. So many procedural hurdles. It was incredibly costly, and sometimes you go through that whole thing and you wouldn't actually be able to take the land that the judge said you could have. Why are these in place? Well, there were the nobles, the elites. They used land to support their families, and it was really important to maintain that land in a complete, comprehensive package. I don't know quite what I'm saying right there, but you wanted to keep it together because that was going to ensure that your family and your descendants were guaranteed that noble lineage. So you had this inequality where you had nobles and then everybody else, and they created laws that protected their property differently than the property of everybody else. They created an institution that gave economic opportunity to them and excluded other people from economic opportunity. This is an example of that Angerman-Sokoloff model, right? Inequality leads to exclusive institutions. Well, as you can imagine, this treatment of property created problems for creditors. In fact, there's a story from Virginia before independence where somebody had made this big loan, and then they tried to go and collect on this loan, but the person had died. After Lee died, Carter found that his personal property was insufficient to satisfy his debts, but that his estate included recently acquired land. Carter suspected that Lee had purchased the land to avoid paying his debts. So this is saying, hey, remember real property and chattel property? There were different protections on this property. You could go after chattel property just fine. Well, this guy had a bunch of chattel property, and when he realized he wasn't going to be able to pay his debts, he sold that chattel property and he went and bought a bunch of land. And that land was protected from this creditor. He was able to basically cheat this creditor out of their arrangement just by investing in a certain type of property. So this already is demonstrating that property rights model that we just talked about, where strong property rights determine investment. Well, he was guaranteed a better protection over his real estate property rather than his chattel property, so he changed the way he invested to have those things that he could be protected from. But this was a problem for the creditor because now the creditor can't get their money back. And if a creditor is worried about getting their money back, what kind of things does that do to investment? Well, it's going to cause huge problems for people who want to borrow money to make other investments, right? You have two different property rights at tension here. You have one person who borrowed money and has property, and you have one person who lent money, which is lending their property. And by protecting one person, you're hurting the other. And so that creditor doesn't want to lend out, and so that market becomes smaller, and you don't get as much investment. And remember, investment is important for growing your economy. Well, this all changes in the 1720s and 1730s when there's a huge drop in sugar and tobacco prices, and suddenly there's a credit crunch. There are all these farmers who had taken out tons of loans, and now they can't pay back these loans because prices have dropped. Now, that's a big problem for the creditors because the creditors aren't going to get their money back. And so those creditors start lobbying Parliament and saying, hey, we can't get money back from these farmers in the islands who have borrowed all this money because we can't go after their property. They used our money to buy land, but you're not letting us go after their land to get our money back. We want to get that back. So Parliament passes the Debt Recovery Act of 1732. This made all forms of property available for covering unsecured debt. But it's only in the colonies. It's not back in England. If somebody in the colonies borrowed money from you, you can go after them for any property they own. But back in England, Nope, that landed property is still protected. So look at this. This is an example of that public choice model, right? We have a small group of people, the creditors, who are going to lose a lot of money if they can't go after this debt. If they can't go after property, and they have the opportunity to gain a ton of money if they can. And so they go and they expend a lot to try and convince Parliament to change the law. And they do. But they only change it in the place where you don't have another group that's going to fight them. Lots of public choice theory going on here. Well, the Debt Recovery Act actually eliminates a lot of risks of lending to people in the Americas. So it reduces the risk of unsecured debt. You don't have to worry about whether you can claim real property. You can try and go after that if the person doesn't pay. There's none of that risk of hiding personal property where someone sells a bunch of their cows and goes buys a bunch of land to try and avoid being collected on. Like now it doesn't matter. They're going to come after whatever property you have. And there's no risk of local legislators protecting debtors. Now, local legislators would have their constituency of farmers in the area, and they would try to thwart creditors coming after their citizens. And now this law gets rid of those protections. Local legislators are not able to protect the farmers because everyone's being treated equally. And there are some important economic effects of this. The cost of defaults declines because now it's much cheaper to go after people. You have interest rates declining because now it's less risky to go and lend this money, so people start competing by lowering their interest rates. And so in some cases, you see legal reductions in the interest rate. Like Jamaica responded to the act by lowering the legal interest rate by 20%. Then, of course, there's just more capital available for investment. More people are willing to lend out their money because they know that they're going to get paid back. So this is just a really interesting case because we've weakened somebody's property rights. We said, hey, let's weaken property rights over land. You don't get to protect your own land no matter what. There are cases where we can take away your land. So we're weakening those property rights, and yet we're seeing economic growth as a result. Really interesting tension. These are the kind of things that are really fun to look at. Like, it's important when we're looking at these models to think about sometimes they're like protecting property rights is important for economic growth, but there's a point at which you're protecting it too much. It can actually hurt economic growth, and we can get more growth by weakening property rights. I don't know where we are right now, but in terms of how good our property rights are, but it's a really interesting tension that we need to consider. Let's get into how the United States expanded out west, how the West was won. And I want to just preface this by saying this is not a lecture on the morality or the whether this was an ethical expansion. Right now, obviously, there were people who had property out west. We have Native Americans covering the land, and there's we're going to talk about that fight between the Americans and the Native Americans. I'm not saying that what they did was right. I'm not saying what they did was wrong. There's a lot of moral judgments that need to go on here. We talked about this in slavery, where profit maximization does not mean that you're making an ethical decision. But what I want to go at this, I want to imagine this more like a case study where we're looking at a business and the strategy they employed to try and get a market. Okay, we're not looking at this as a moral judgment. We're looking at this as how did the United States use property rights to expand out west. It actually is rooted in state capacity. Remember when we talked about state capacity, and legal capacity was your ability to protect property. And we talked about states that were constrained in their capacity. One example we gave was on fiscal capacity, the ability to collect taxes. If you're constrained on collecting taxes, then you're going to try and go for something that is the easiest to go for, like going for trade. Taxing trade is a really easy tax to do because you only need to be in one place, the port, for you to collect that. So you go and collect that in a way that makes it most efficient with the capacity you have. Well, legal capacity is a similar thing. You can't protect everybody's property, especially when they're spread out all over the place. But you might be able to design things so that way you can actually get people in the same place and you can reduce the cost of protecting property. And that's what's happening in the 19th century as we're looking out west. The United States is not strong enough to just protect anybody who decides to go out and settle the West. But if you can strategically organize settlements going out west, then you might be able to protect property much easier than just random settlements scattered all over the place. This is where the Homestead Act of 1862 comes in. The Homestead Act was this plan to go out and settle the West, and it was rooted in the John Locke philosophy. If you went out west and you got a piece of property and you improved it, you put your labor into that property, then you would be able to keep that property for a really cheap rate. And it's important that you understand this was a huge reduction in cost of going out and getting property in the West. It was so cheap that we ran into this problem where you would have land rushes, where people would line up and then they would just rush land and try and get the best piece of land they could because this was such a good deal. In fact, we have monuments to these people who are running out onto the land. And in fact, we name college football teams after them. The Oklahoma Sooners are named after people who went out too soon to rush the land. And it was kind of a derogatory term at first. Like, this was somebody who cheated. And now Oklahoma has just really, taken that name and said, no, we're making it part of our culture. We're calling ourselves Sooners. Now, some people think that homesteading was an inefficient way of distributing this property because you gave it a really low price and you just told people to work on it to keep that land. And possibly a better way to allocate it would have been through auction, where you just allowed people to pay the prices they were willing to pay to get that land. And then you don't have that rushing out in the land. You don't have these fights going on. Possibly auctioning it would have been a better way to do this. But one economist says this is not right. Douglas Allen says that this was actually an efficient way to organize property rights out on the West. And the key to his argument is this graph right here. What you're seeing along the x-axis is population density. And on the y-axis, you're seeing the cost of protecting property. So as you go out and get more people in this area, the cost of protecting property goes up. Why is it going up? Well, because you're creating more valuable property and you're creating something that Native Americans are actually going to want to take. There's a small enough population density that Native American groups will know that, hey, we can go after this, we can take this property, and we can win. But if you can get population density out high enough, where you get enough people in that area, that any conflict with the Native Americans would lead to an easy win by the Americans, then the cost of protecting that property falls. So the American government really wants to leapfrog that part where it's really expensive to protect property and get out to those places where it's cheap to protect property. And so that means you want high population densities. And the Homestead Act was designed to get high population densities. The main evidence for this is that the Homestead Act said you could only go settle in places that had been surveyed. So they outlined exactly where you were allowed to homestead at different times. And so that forced people to all settle in the same place. He gives an example of Florida. The Spanish had tried to go settle Florida, but they always lost to Native Americans. Well, then the United States opens up this area and says, hey, go down there and start homesteading. And by the way, as long you can do this only if you bring a gun. And so they coordinate a whole bunch of people to go down there and live in the same place with weapons to combat any threat to that property. Now, there's another example of Texas. Now, Texas originally was part of Mexico, but Mexicans invited Americans to come and say, hey, as long as you convert to Catholicism, you can come and live in this area. So you get a bunch of people who come, move to Texas, and then all of a sudden they're like, yeah, we really like being part of the United States, and they split that territory off and it goes back to the United States. Well, now you have this threat for those settlements that you've got not only the Native Americans out in the West, but you also have these Mexicans who are thinking, we want our property back. And so what we see after this Texas independence is we get homesteads set up right along the border of Texas and Mexico and Texas and the Western frontier, trying to create this buffer zone of protection from these threats. You're trying to coordinate settlements and create a dense population so that way there's no threat of that property being taken. Doug Allen actually focuses on Utah as well, so I want to bring that up since here we are in Utah. He talks about how there was an exception that kind of proves the rule here. Utah was settled by pioneers moving out west to gain religious independence, and you had a group of people who actually had a unique relationship with Native Americans. Because of their unique beliefs, they actually believed that Native Americans were part of an ancient civilization that had connections to Christianity, and so they were on a mission to try and bring this group back into Christianity. And one of those early early settlers, or those early pioneers, was named Brigham Young. He said it was manifestly more economical and less expensive to feed and clothe than to fight them. So he's looking at trying to protect property rights by handling Native Americans in a way that reduces the threat to property. So Doug Allen says, hey, this is evidence that that threat to property was a really important part of settling the West, and you could solve that problem through homesteading by moving people out there, or by trying to create alliances, by trying to feed and clothe them rather than fight them. So brings us up as settling the West was fundamentally an issue about property rights and how you deal with those threats. Let me conclude by bringing up the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons is something that has existed at least since Aristotle. Now, the actual tragedy has existed for all of history, but the observation on this has existed at least since Aristotle. He said, what is common to the greatest number has the least care bestowed upon it. Everyone thinks chiefly of his own, hardly at all of the common interest. So if we have something that belongs to everyone, if we don't assign property rights to specific people, then there becomes this problem where it gets overused. I like to call this the reason why we weren't allowed to have Oreos in our house when I was growing up. The problem with having this container of Oreos is that this is common property to the whole family. Everyone is allowed to have some of these Oreos. Well, that means that if I want to have Oreos today, I might have a few, but if I don't have those and I say, oh, maybe I'll have a few Oreos tomorrow, I'm risking that my brother or my dad might come in and eat some of my Oreos that I was planning on saving for tomorrow. So if I don't eat those Oreos today, then I am not going to have the Oreos tomorrow, and I lose out on some delicious cookies. So the problem is those Oreos run out way too fast because everybody is allowed to have some, and everybody knows that if they don't eat them today, they're not going to get any at all. And so everyone overuses the Oreos rather than spreading them out over a day or two. An example of this is just pollution generally. And here's a picture of the inversion in Utah and how bad this air gets, because air is common property to all of us. We all get to use the air. No one's going to stop us. And since we all use it, none of us really has an incentive to take care of it. So we drive our cars a little bit more than we need to. We use gas-powered snowblowers when we could be using electric or just shoveling. And these things add particulates to the air, and as a result, we get pollution and the inversion in the winter. So the tragedy of the commons is when something has common property to everybody that we then all overuse it or we abuse it. Now, one of the solutions to the tragedy of the commons is just to assign private property. Now, it's going to be really hard with air, but with cookies, we could say this row belongs to me, this row belongs to my brother, this row belongs to my dad, and we each have property over that row of cookies. That is one solution we can have. Or we can have a government that deals with regulating how we use that. So in the cases of cookies, my mom might say, here's your allocation of cookies. Or in the case of air pollution, we might say, these are the types of cars you're allowed to drive, or the snow throwers you're allowed to use, and they're going to be the ones that pollute less. In some situations, we might resolve them through totally different organizations where we don't have property rights or assigned to individuals or the government, but we come up with this like in-between phase. This was an idea really championed by Elinor Ostrom, who was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics. She documents all these really interesting cases where people are able to solve common property issues just by working together and coming up with different solutions other than having a government or going towards private property. So the tragedy of commons is a serious issue, and there isn't a clear way that we solve this. Again, you might have private property, we might have government property, or we have some sort of arrangement in the middle. But it's a property rights issue, but it's not a clear way of how we resolve it. I want to conclude by just going to George Washington's farewell address. When he left the presidency, he addressed property rights. He said, "Where is the security of property for reputation for life if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths which are the instruments of investigation in courts of justice? Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle." Now, I bring this up because This is George Washington connecting property rights to morality. And he says it's motivated through religious principle. Now that's a question that's open for debate, but the motivation by morality is indisputable. There are going to be times where you feel tempted to violate people's property. That is something where you need to constrain that, right? This is like slavery, right? Just because something's legal doesn't mean it's ethical. Same thing here. We need to make sure that we respect people's property, even in those cases where we might be able to get away with it.